To set up and use initialization blocks and variables, you will perform the following steps. Create an initialization block, create variables, and test your work. Let's get started. Now, before we get into the details of creating variables, there are some things that I would like you to know before we move ahead. The Variable Manager dialog box has two panes. The left pane displays a tree that shows variables and initialization blocks, and the right pane displays the details of the item you select in the left pane. Repository variables and system and non-system session variables are represented by a question mark icon. The icon for an initialization block is a cube labeled I. There are basically 4 different types of variables in OBIEE 11G. Session variables is the first one. Second, we have repository variables. Third, we have presentation variables. And 4, we have request variables. About session variables. As the name suggests, session variables are created during the creation of a session. That is, as soon as a user logs into the Oracle BI server. So every login has its own session variable. There are 2 types of session variables. The system, which are defined by OBIEE and are reserved. Non-system, which are defined by developers. Session variables can be created only through the Oracle Business Intelligence Administration tool. Presentation variables. A presentation variable is a variable which can be created as part of the creation of a dashboard prompt. Dashboard prompts must either be column prompt or variable prompt. Then we have the request variable. The request variable is used to overwrite the value of session variables, and it happens only during request initialization to the database from column prompt. These can be created only during the creation of the column prompt. Use repository variable to set up constant values that can be used anywhere, such as the month or the current year. The Oracle Business Intelligence Server will substitute the value of the repository variable for the variable itself in the metadata. You initialize dynamic repository variable in the same way as static variables, but the values are refreshed by data returned from queries. When defining a dynamic repository variable, you create an initialization block or use a pre-existing one that contains an SQL query. You will also set up a schedule that the Oracle BI server will follow to execute the query and periodically refresh the value of the variable. To create a repository variable, we will open the paint.rpd repository file and then perform the following tasks as demonstrated here. This part shows you how to create a new static variable called current year with a year value of 2008. The first step is to open the RPD, and then we'll follow the next step as demonstrated in this lab. So we'll go ahead and click File, Open, you type the password, admin123, open the RPD. Once the RPD has been opened, on the Tools menu bar, we'll click Manage, then we'll choose Variables. Next, we'll click Action, New, Repository, Variable. On the new window which opens, the variable will be named current year. And the type will be static. And the default initialize will be 2008. And the only reason why we're using 2008, we're considering the history of the data that we're holding in the paint.rpd repository. Otherwise, if we had most current data, we would have used our current year. 2008, therefore, does not hold any special meaning. For the description, we shall therefore just type in current year variable. And then we'll click OK. that's it. That is how you create a static repository variable. And to be able to view the variable, we'll click on repository, and then you will notice that on the right reading pane there is a variable named current year, and this is how you can view it. If you wanted to view this variable, you could simply double click on it and you see how it's been defined. The name, the type, which is static, default initializer, which is 2008, and then current year variable is a simple description we provided. Click OK, and that is how you create a static repository variable. We'll go ahead and close this window. In the next steps, I will show you how to create a dynamic repository variable. But before we can create a dynamic repository variable, Oracle recommends that you create a dedicated connection pool to be used for initialization blocks. It is recommended that you create a dedicated connection pool for initialization blocks. This connection pool should not be used for any other queries. Additionally, it is also recommended that you isolate the connection pools for different types of initialization blocks. This also makes sure that the authentication and login specific initialization blocks do not slow down the login process. Initialization blocks should be designed so that the maximum number of Oracle BI server variables may be assigned by each block. For example, if you have 5 variables, it is more efficient and less resource intensive to construct a single initialization block containing all 5 variables. When using one initialization block, the values will be resolved with one call to the back-end tables using the initialization string. Constructing 5 initialization blocks, one for each variable, would result in 5 calls to the back-end tables for assignment. Now that we understand the importance of avoiding resource usage efficiency, we need to create a dedicated connection pool for use with all our initialization blocks.